Welcome to the Australian Water School, the home of demand-driven industry design training for the global water sector.
Hello, I'm your host, Cray Price, and on behalf of the Australian Water School, welcome to today's webinar covering the extreme rainfall and runoff events in Australia that took place in early 2022. Now, we thought this one would be attended mostly by Australian viewers, but if you look at this map of registrations, welcome to all of you from all around the world, over 70 countries. It looks like these events were so extreme that they've got international attention as well. So welcome not just to our Australian attendees, which are all packed in there, as you can see, but to the overseas attendees as well, both for those watching today's live session and to those who will be tuning into this recording later on. Now, although today's panelists are coming to you virtually from all across Australia to wherever you are, we do want to make an acknowledgement of country. We want to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners, custodians, and carers of the land and waters on which we all live, work, and meet. We do pay our respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. So for today on World Water Day, I'm looking at that globe. World Water Day has actually passed here in Australia, but in much of the world, it is still March 22nd. So we can wish each other a very productive World Water Day. Today's topic is definitely very relevant. And I'd like to introduce to you panelists who are coming to you virtually here from all across Australia. We're lucky to be joined by these expert panelists who have an extensive background and qualifications in being able to address some of the questions that are coming up. So if each of you can turn your cameras on, and we'll have you introduce yourselves. We'll start with Mark and then just go through the list as you see it there. Let us know what your background is, what your specialty area is, and if you can just let us know, have you been affected by these flood events recently, and if so, how have you been affected? Over to you, Mark.
So it's Mark Babister from WMA Water, and I guess my interest is in design flood estimation, and one of the key authors, editors of AR&R. So that's why I'm here today. In terms of the flooding, I haven't been affected, but like a lot of other people, my grass is out of control. It's been an incredibly wet summer, and a lawnmower is not going to fix it.
Yes. All right. Over to you. Let's see. I don't have that list in front of me anymore in the order, but let's go to Kathy. I'll go in the list, the order that I see it on my panel here.
Yeah, thanks, Gray. Kathy Barton, so I'm with BMG. I'm very much a practitioner in the hydrology and hydraulics space, and doing flood studies and flood risk management studies. I guess in particular 2D modelling and design estimation. Have I been affected? Not directly, thankfully, but I've definitely had some very good friends and relatives that have been fully impacted and are currently out of their houses. So yeah, it's been a bit of a nasty time on the Brisbane creeks.
Yes, certainly. Over to you, Bryson.
My name's Bryson Bates. I'm a hydroclimatologist, now retired. I do have an interest in climate variability and climate change. In terms of effect, I'm with Cray over in Perth in Western Australia. So there was no direct effect on me, but there's certainly been an effect on my mother who, when I was much younger and she was younger, we were involved in the Hunter Valley floods in 1955, and that brought a lot of bad memories back for her. So the trauma lives on.
Yes.
I'll stop there, Craig.
Certainly. Okay, over to you, Fiona.
Hi everyone, Fiona Johnson from UNSW. My research and teaching is in statistical hydrology, design flood estimation. Before joining UNSW, I worked at the Bureau of Meteorology as part of the IFD revision project. I haven't personally been affected by the floods, but just watch with devastation at what's happened around the world, and my heart goes out to all those who've been affected.
Yes, thanks. Let's hear from James.
Yeah, hi everyone, James Liebman from Water Technology. I'm a flooding engineer, so I can talk a bit today about the implications that this major event has on our current and recently completed flood studies and what effect it has on FFAs and the IFDs we use. As a flood engineer, I bought a house in the floodplain right next to Norman Creek, so I moved everything upstairs and sandbagged everything, but luckily we just escaped this time around, whereas my family home flooded in 2011 and my sister's house flooded this year. So this is my second major flood cleanup, if you don't count all the other times, I was a member of the State Emergency Service for 5 years, so I've done my fair share of sandbagging.
Excellent. Okay, some hands-on experience there then. Danny, representing or coming to us as a representative of Floodplain Management Australia, one of our supporting organizations here.
Thanks very much, Craig. So I've got two hats on today. I'm representing FMA, which is the peak national body for flood risk practitioners in Australia. We promote wise management and development on floodplains, increasing community awareness about flood risk, and helping to reduce risks of flooding to life and property. I'm also the manager of roads and stormwater at Tweed Shire Council. So one of the far north coast of New South Wales councils that were very severely impacted by the flooding 4 weeks ago, as well as Cyclone Debbie in 2017. So while my first-hand experience of AR&R and hydraulic modelling and the like is limited, I can certainly talk about first-hand experience of those two extreme rainfalls as a local government practitioner. I live in the Tweed. My house was thankfully fine. I'm a floodplain manager who purposely bought just above the flood extent, but pretty much everything from my front door to my desk is absolutely devastated at the moment.
Wow. Well, yes. So we have some people with firsthand experience and knowledge of the events themselves. But what we're really after today is what does this mean for the future? So I'm going to share my screen here, and what we'll do, today's format, again, differs a bit from our standard webinars. We don't have a formal presentation, but I'm going to show a few slides just to get the discussion going in the background. And these slides just show a little bit about the consequences of these floods. And, you know, like in a conference, the setting that we'd like to have in this forum, like we hopefully will get back to someday in doing live conferences, is a panel where you've got some people sitting at a table who can stand up and answer some questions, but you, the audience, have the mic. And it's like you're coming up and asking these questions. So do get onto the Q&A line, ask the questions there. We've already got about 40 or 50 questions that have come in just through the registration line alone. So we've got plenty to go on, but we want to see, what do you want to know about from these expert panelists? In the background, besides the people that you see here on your screen, we have got Rory Nathan, Martin Hendricks, Jason Evans, and other experts in a multitude of fields. We wanted to get academia, practitioners, government representatives, insurance company representatives, and the insurance industry. We've got all those people in the background who have been given access to the Q&A line to answer your questions. So it's not just the panelists that you see here. We do anticipate quite a few because of the, we've had over 2,000 registrations here. So keep those questions coming, upvote the ones that you would like to hear from the most. Now, anytime a big flood comes around, you've seen that we used extreme, the word extreme in the title here. When a big flood comes around, we are likely to say, wow, that was an extreme event. You know, whether it's one that comes around every 5 years or 10 years, or, you know, something that you've only seen once in your lifetime, we'll call it extreme. But today we're going to be a bit pedantic about our terminology, and we're going to apply the Australian rainfall and runoff definitions, which you can see here in this chart. And in order to move into the realm of extreme in these charts here, you're looking at the 1 in 2,000 annual exceedance probability event. And so you see that right there. Anytime you're above this line, technically we have moved from very rare into extreme. So when we're up in these zones, whether or not you hit the probable maximum precipitation or design flood, we are technically in the extreme. So we can rightfully use that word extreme. And I do want to just acknowledge, I mean, when you're a hydrologist and you see these events come around, this is what we plan for, this is what we prepare for, this is what we model, and we get a little bit excited about it. But we've got to keep in mind, you know, this is deeply personal and tragic on so many fronts. There were, I think, at least 33 lives lost in the 2011 events. This time around, there are 22, I think that's the final number that I've seen, 22 individuals who lost their lives in this event. This is serious business, and we can't, and one of the questions we want to pose to the panel and to those listening in, as flood practitioners and professionals, have we done what we needed to do in response to these things to reduce the loss of life, reduce the economic damage going forward and the impacts on people? That's a question that we can all ask ourselves. Now, how bad were these events, or how large were these events? I'll refer you to this website on the Bureau of Meteorology's homepage, where we've got Australia's record rainfalls listed. And it includes a chart here. This is like an envelope curve, where you can see these are the worst ones, or the highest intensity rainfalls for each duration that have ever been recorded in Australia and in the world record. Now, you'll note that these high ones come from a single gauge on a single mountaintop. So how do we compare to these? What you can do is you can take your individual rainfall events, and on the Bureau of Meteorology's website, you can then select your area, find out what the probabilities are for various intensities along the range of durations, and then what you can do is plot them with observed rainfall. So you enter that data here, and once you enter it, you'll get a IFD curve, intensity, frequency, duration curve, on which you can plot your event. And you'll see that, well, wasn't much to speak of on this one for the shorter durations, but by the time you got into the longer durations, we are up in the extreme category. And what I've done in some cases here is to take these IFD curves that we've got once you enter in the actual data, and then rescale them a little bit so that they match right up, and then we find out how close did we get to the records. And in some cases, we have some cases where it looks like we've exceeded them, but as we look at the data, maybe there are some other things going on. This is a particular gauge that came through where I believe that there are some issues with the shorter duration rainfalls that exceed any rainfall ever measured on the planet Earth. And in that case, you might want to have a look at your data and QA/QC it to make sure that it's valid. But in any case, we've got enough gauges to show the probabilities that there were some events in these last couple of weeks that did exceed the 1 in 2,000 probability. And so I'll save the rest of the slides for the discussion later on. Let me go back to the IFDs, and let's open this up to the panel, and let's find out from everybody, what is the least frequent, the rarest, the most extreme citation you have heard in reference to these events? I've heard the 1 in 2,000 mentioned. I've heard people say 1 in 5, 1 in 10,000. I haven't heard many say this has exceeded a PMP or a PMF. So maybe we'll start with Mark on that, and then open it up to the panel. What is the most extreme reference you have heard?
So the most extreme one I've heard that I'm comfortable with is about 1 in 10,000. There are some suggestions that there's things approaching the PMF, but I haven't done any due diligence on that. But one thing I have found is all of the sites with really rare rainfalls have certain characteristics. They're generally not the Bureau gauges, and they're generally most of the time on hills or rugged terrain. Not always.
And that can make a big difference, where, again, the thing I mentioned, that one set of records in Australia is from a mountaintop, but mostly we don't put gauges up on a mountaintop. You put the gauges where you've got some development. And so it might be skewed a little bit. There might be plenty of places where we've exceeded these more often than not, but those gauges aren't figured in. Is that kind of what you're saying, Mark? Yeah,
that's exactly what I'm saying. The places where we have long-term rain gauges are where you can put a town or a farm or development, because there's got to be somebody there to read the gauges, particularly for long-term gauges before we had electronic equipment.
Yes. Excellent. Now, one of the main questions that's come in, and again, lots of questions coming in on the Q&A line. We've already got over 20 questions have rolled in just in the first couple of minutes. One of the main questions here is related to the weather patterns, and what did climate change have to do with these events? And that's been a general question that many people asked in the introductory comments to for the registrations. And maybe we'll have Bryson take a stab at that, just answering that general question, then maybe open it up to Fiona and Kathy and others. Do you have any thoughts on what role does climate change play in these events from a few weeks ago?
Thanks, Craig. I think most people know that given favourable conditions, with increases in air temperature, the atmosphere can hold more moisture. But to answer, when you're looking at specific regions like around Brisbane and the Northern Rivers of New South Wales, I'm sure there are a lot of people doing attribution studies around this country, trying to work out or get some estimate of what percentage of the event was due to climate change. I think the limitations of those studies, I'm not a climate modeller, from my point of view, is that they are based on climate models. And I don't believe, Fiona might contradict me here, but a lot of the early studies I've seen in this area don't, from my point of view, do enough due diligence on whether the models are fit for purpose in terms of replicating these kinds of events in the historical record. I'm not a climate change denier, don't get me wrong. I think it is an issue, and I think it's something we're going to have to deal with. And in certain regions of the world, we're going to see floods with increasing intensity and perhaps duration, and becoming more frequent. But that's not true for everywhere. Where I live in Western Australia, what we're tending to see, our rainfall here is dominated by winter rainfall, but the atmosphere is actually drying, and it's been drying now for about 30 years. And it seems to be an ongoing trend. So you can't just go willy-nilly and saying any large events due to climate change. As far as I'm concerned, you need to do a bit more legwork than that.
Excellent.
I'll leave it there.
Thanks. Yeah,
Right.
Thanks for that. And in Western Australia, I mean, the events that we're focusing on today are the ones that resulted in a substantial loss of life and loss of property damage on the East Coast. But at the same time, in WA, even though we haven't really been affected as much monetarily, we did have I think the second highest rainfall ever measured, and we had the hottest day on record. Ever measured, I think in January. So this was a few weeks ahead of time, and that was blamed on some of these systems that you see here. This is in WA. Is there a correlation that we have these hottest days, this heat coming up, and then the capacity increases, and is that leading to increased rainfall? The chances, and this is a question from some of the Q&A line discussions. What are the chances that we talk about a 1 in 10,000 event? That here we are on planet Earth. What are the chances that you'd be around when a 1 in 10,000 event occurs? It's something that is a question worth asking. Is this getting more and more common? And one of the questions then I'll highlight here on the Q&A line is about blocking systems. So while we're talking about weather, if anybody, maybe I'll turn it over to Fiona if you have any comments on that. There are some questions about the blocking systems that just stall and just sit there, where in the past they've tended to move more freely across their path, and now as they sit there and just dump rain, is that something that's trending upwards here?
I won't answer that question directly, but I think the idea of why it's raining and what these storms tell us is something that as an industry we haven't done a lot of. We think about rainfalls or even floods in a quite a statistical sense, and they're all from the same distribution. And I think increasingly with climate change, that sort of approach is not going to get us far enough. And so that gets to the questions of answering Bryson's questions about, well, are the climate models good enough at the sorts of events that we want to look at, which is where Jason Evans's really high resolution models kind of come in, because they have some ability to get some of these events. But we need to know a lot more about when it's rained, why it's rained, and what that tells us about the characteristics of that rain. And it's really only since the satellite era that we have enough data and reanalysis data that even allows us to start to answer that questions. But I think we need to do more to understand that more broadly. As far as we're blocking events becoming more frequent, I think we just as hydrologists need to be working much more closely with climatologists and meteorologists to understand these sorts of risks. And you know, the thing that we haven't really discussed yet as well is that this has all happened in a La Nina system as well. And so we've got really wet catchments. And I think we don't really think about those sorts of smaller levels of non-stationarity as well as the climate non-stationarity, you know, in terms of risk.
No, thanks. One question that I'll ask, you know, when we're talking about these systems moving and whether we've modeled them appropriately, Kathy, in your modeling work, you know, in the past, we tend to just have a stationary, you know, a single rainfall pattern, you know, temporally and spatially, we've got a temporal variation of the pattern, but now moving these storms through the system. Do you see a trend toward, in the 2D modeling world for flood modeling, moving toward gridded data and spatially varying systems? And, you know, is that affecting the results that you're coming up with?
I think for large systems, I think there's definitely a place for that. So for large catchment areas, you know, there needs to be some consideration of the spatial distribution of the rainfall system over the catchment, because it can have a significant impact. And the larger the catchment is, the more likely it is that you're going to get that variation in rainfall distribution across the catchment. So yes, I think there is a place for it. I think as 2D modelling, you know, it's becoming faster and better and in every way. And so I think that there will be in the future a better capacity to take into account variation. But it's the same as everything. There's a lot of uncertainty around that as well. So, you know, it's probably more about how you're dealing with the uncertainty and making sure that the uncertainty becomes part of the equation as well. You know, how a particular event might move one way through a catchment and the next event might move the other way because they're driven by different climate systems. So I think that the answer technically is yes, that can be done. And, you know, I think that we're starting to do it in some of the large catchments. We are taking into account spatial changes in the way the rainfall falls. But yeah, I think that the uncertainty is not yet known and we need to be very careful.
Thanks. I'll ask the same question to James at Water Technology. If you know, are you seeing more and more of these models that account for that? And if so, is that adding accuracy? You know, can you take the radar data that shows what's happening in the air and actually translate that into what you would be measuring on the ground for rainfall excess? You know, what kind of calibration is needed? Is this where you see the industry heading?
Well, so the BOM does have a product that is called calibrated radar rainfall. So it uses the Doppler radar, which just measures reflectivity, and then that gets translated to a rainfall depth based on the ground rain gauges. So it's calibrated to that. So that provides us with a you know, spatially and temporally varying rainfall series that we can put into a flood model. Which is great for calibration and post-event stuff. But if you want to do flood forecasting, you want to have a similar data set that's based on a forecast model, which is obviously very difficult because a storm can you know, obviously unpredictable. They might just skim a catchment, and getting that accuracy is hard. So there's obviously a lot of work to do for the industry with flood forecasting, but it's definitely happening in the background. Lots of consultants are looking into it. In terms of climate change, I think it's very difficult to, again, not a climate scientist either, but difficult to disentangle a climate change signature from the natural variability, and the amount of unknowns with the extreme rainfall estimates we come up with is quite large. So yeah, I find it difficult to see a signature there at all.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly. I think that's something that everybody needs to, those are factors that I think we all need to be considering. Mark, comments on that?
Yeah, I think we need to keep in mind, we've got a very short record in Australia. Our rain gauge record goes back to about 1880, but even from 1900 onwards, it starts to become reasonably dense. And on many catchments, we find the really big events were in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. So whenever we form any opinion on this very short sample, and think about what happened in the past, because I've spent a lot of time recently going through the historical records, which are now very easily to access. And many catchments, the largest events occurred in the 1800s, whether it's in southeast Queensland, the northern rivers, or as far down as Sydney. So this is an extreme event, don't get me wrong, but there's been some pretty big events we don't know much about.
Yes. And that you mentioned 100 years of record. Well, here in WA, most of the projects I work on are in areas where we might have 3 years or 5 years or 8 years of record because nobody's been keeping anything out there in some of these areas where we got the mines going in, and our uncertainty bands are just massive. A couple of general questions then that I want to get into here. That may be a little bit contentious, but the terminology. Have you seen, and this will be to the panelists live, and those also in response to some of the written comments on the Q&A line, has the media latched on yet to the recommended nomenclature changes, and are we doing a disservice, when we allow those that terminology to remain as has been in the past, where it's a bit misleading when we talk about the 100-year event versus the 1% annual exceedance probability event. Do you see have you seen changes? And Danny, maybe I'll ask you that question to start out with. Have you seen people begin to adopt those recommended changes in not referring to the year anymore, but talking about the probability itself?
No, I don't, Craig, certainly not in the media. And even in the industry ourselves, particularly when we're speaking to non-technical people, we do still default to talk about 100-year floods and 1,000-year storms and things like that, just because it's ingrained in our culture or our understanding of these sorts of events. We do tend to then go on to explain what that means a bit more, but certainly the terminology is still very widespread, and I can't see that changing, unfortunately.
Yes, it takes a while. There's a clip I might include in some of the resources, some video clips. There's so many that we could have included here, where discussing the same event in the same place. We've got the media referring to it, 10 different ways. And again, looking at these charts here on the recommended nomenclature to use, this ARI, there are no blues in it. Okay, so if you hear this being used, that's not in line with the recommendations. You can talk about exceedances per year, you can talk about annual exceedance probability, and we can say the 1 in 1,000 or the 1 in 2,000, but in no case are we being recommended to talk about a 100-year event anymore.
The term I do hear more often is unprecedented, which isn't on that left-hand column.
Yeah, and I've seen some people react to that. So can we rightly say, if it's an event that has exceeded all previous records, can we rightly say this is unprecedented, or would we take issue with that as an industry?
Well, yeah, I mean, it might be unprecedented for one particular gauge or location for sure, but generally, no, it's not unprecedented unless it's breaking world records.
And it's certainly been anticipated. We run PMFs, we run very rare events. And yeah, we went away and looked up the exact definition of unprecedented. And okay, if you haven't seen it at that gauge before, you can probably get away with that wording, but I don't like it.
Yes, yeah, and I've seen some reactions in that way. So yes, when we say unprecedented, sometimes, and we do need to be careful, because that's one of the reasons some of our headline acts have had to pull out, because their sponsoring institutions are not comfortable making any statements right now that's going to go on the record as to the recurrence interval, the exceedance probability, while these things are going to certainly go into litigation. And so when we say unprecedented, sometimes that implies that, oh, we shouldn't have expected this. This is act of God. Oh, we shouldn't be responsible for this. And absolutely we should, as an industry, be expecting these things. Maybe not everywhere, maybe not at all. And I see one comment come up, Rain bomb. What do you all think of that? I saw that come up 100 times in the media. Rain bomb. What are your impressions of that? Fiona, I see you shaking your head.
It's a very media cool term that I think doesn't mean anything to anyone, but I can see why people, in a hand waving sense, describe this water coming down in such intensity. So, but I don't think it's helpful for us to be using terms like that as an industry, because I think we know more than that. We can be much better at, and then educating, other people about, like East Coast lows and their risk. If people understand that these are events that can sit off the coast, and therefore the Bureau has not complete certainty about how close it will come into the coast or exactly where it will cross, then people can start to understand, okay, well, this is the conditions that we're dealing with, and prepare, accordingly.
Yeah, thanks. And again, if you are a designer and if you're an engineer, the notification for this event went out to all of Engineers Australia's subscribers for the water panels. If you are an engineer designing a floodway, for instance, we ought to be considering these events, these extreme events in the design, whether it's part of the design criteria or you're just testing it with a greater than design event. When we look at these floodways, we need to make sure that they will stay intact afterwards, because even if you can convince people to stop driving through the floodwaters, once it recedes, you can still have some stability issues that could still lead to some unsafe conditions. Next question, which is one of the most upvoted ones here. Let me pull this back up, and I'm going to stop the share and just go back to the panel to ask this question. When we figure this in, how are we going to these events in? How is this going to affect our IFD curves going forward? And so let's just kind of go back through in order. I'll go over to James. I know James, you did a couple of analyses on some of these events, and what would happen if you took our previous data and now pop this one in? How does that affect the curves going forward?
Yeah, so it doesn't. That it's up to the BOM to decide how it affects the curves. But as practitioners and as flood models, we can use them and tweak them how we see appropriate. Just to give a couple of examples, we've been working on a flood study for a council west of Brisbane, and we were getting pretty close to finalising all the design parameters, all the losses and everything. And of course, this happened. So we have to go back and revisit our FFA. So our FFA was based on a gauge that had 26 years of data, which is at the lower end of what you'd want to base an FFA on. If you have 30 years of data, that's not bad, but yeah, 26 is the least you want. And we found that including the the February 2022 event increased our 1% AEP estimate by 25% in terms of peak flow. So it's significant. We also did the Mary River flood study for Gympie Regional Council a couple of years ago. In that case, our FFA was based on a gauge of 117 years of stream gauge data. So a very good long record. And even then, we had to factor IFDs up to match the FFA by 13%. So that's not to say that the IFDs are wrong. They're estimates, and I think it's entirely appropriate to factor them when needed. Yeah, so that on the screen, that's the FFA plot for the catchment west of Brisbane. I just won't say which catchment it is because we've only just done the analysis and we haven't spoken to the council yet about the implications of it. But yeah, obviously you can see it's pretty significant. So it means we have to go back and revisit particularly our losses, but also our IFD factorization.
Yeah, and sometimes when you look at a curve like this, so the black lines with the confidence bands versus the red lines with the confidence bands, these look fairly close, but again, that's in the vertical direction. Sometimes in the horizontal, there's quite a bit of uncertainty, especially considering that this is a log scale. So sorry, I was trying to find that one that you had put together there so that you could speak to that.
I mean, the other thing to note is that even with the increase, it's still within the confidence band of the previous estimate.
Yes.
So what we had previously as well isn't wrong. What we're saying is that's our best guess based on the data currently available, but it could be anywhere in between those lines, or the 95 and 5% confidence intervals. So that, yeah, that's just something we sometimes struggle, I think, to convey to planners and the public, is that yeah, that 1% estimate is an estimate. It can vary quite a bit.
Yeah, and what you'll find, at least in the regions I work in, is that is even when we get into regional flood frequency estimation, the 95% confidence for the 1 in 100 event, the 1% AEP event, sometimes is greater than the 5% confidence interval for the 50%. You know, the one that we call the 2-year sometimes could be greater than the 100-year and vice versa, all within reasonable confidence bands. I'm putting up a couple of slides here that Rory Nathan put together for us. And Rory, thank you for answering all these questions in the background. There are 80 open questions. So all of the panelists, I know I don't want to divert your attention too far from our discussion, but do have a look at those. Sorry, go ahead.
So Craig, this is an interesting example here Rory's done. He's got 60 years, which is a lot longer than what James had for his site. Yep. But even that 60 years, if we go back another 70 years, there are a lot more big floods in the prior 70 years than there are in the last 60 years. And you know, we've got short records in Australia. It's always a challenge. And we have to understand that those confidence limits are very broad. And if you add an extra event onto a short sample, you know, you'll get big changes if it's a big event.
Yeah.
But we could revise this one with extra data. Sorry, Fiona.
That, you know, I guess it's also worth noting that the IFD data that the Bureau, it comes from the Bureau's website, is not for a single site. It is provided at a point, but it is regionalised to include data from multiple sites in determining the shape of the relationship. And so if you add an individual event to a single site, you get the sort of big changes like Rory was showing there. But then Rory also had a second line there where he had a regionalised skewness, which is closer to the way that the IFDs are derived on the Bureau's site. And you see smaller changes then. So we did analysis back when we were deriving the new IFDs at the Bureau that were sort of part of the early stage of, they're not the final ones that were published, but part of the early stage of the revision for AR&R. It was in 2012, and we got a massive flood event come across the sort of the Murray kind of area. Many gauges had their largest rainfalls on record. And so we did analysis after that showed, and this is published, you know, in Journal of Hydrology regional studies, that shows that if you just looked at the individual change at an individual gauge, you got quite large increases. But when the data is regionalized, or you borrow strength from surrounding areas, then it tends to be that increase is moderated. So instead of being a 15% increase, it's still like it's a 10% increase. So I think that's one thing to take into account. But the comments that we had before about the fact that we don't have a great gauging network on the top of mountains, so that we're probably, you know, underestimating orographic effects, still stands. So we haven't regionalized in that sense because there's no data to include. So, you know, the sorts of changes you see in your flood frequency analysis, if you're talking about 26 years of data, do not translate to IFDs because a lot more data has been used in rainfalls. But I would echo that the uncertainty even then, when you're using the equivalent of 500 years of data to derive these IFD curves, is huge. It's 20% at least, sort of, you know, through it. And I see so much work in industry working on like calibrating Manning's ends to, you know, the nth degree. And yet our rainfall inputs are so uncertain, and we don't have a great way of dealing with that uncertainty in the rainfall inputs. We have Monte Carlo's sampling rainfall, you know, losses uncertainty or temporal pattern uncertainty, and yet we take the rainfalls sampling from these curves as precise lines, and yet they have their own bands around them. And I think we could do more there.
Yes. So I'll ask you the question then, Fiona. The most upvoted question, almost 50 upvotes here. Have we underestimated our design rainfalls? Is that a simple yes or no?
It's not a simple yes or no. You know, every time you get an event that is larger than has been recorded at a gauge, it will cause IFDs to go up. As that very, preliminary analysis from Rory showed, it's still within the confidence limits that would be on the published curves. But as you get more of these events, and you're likely to get them with climate change, then the question of a stationary IFD curve becomes quite an interesting philosophical discussion.
Yes. Excellent. And on that philosophy then, the next most upvoted question here is, well, instead of considering the 1 in 100 for designs, and maybe Kathy, I'll turn that question over to you, where we typically design whatever infrastructure is typically designed to the 1 in 100 event, a 1% AEP event, based on the increase in severity and the frequency of flooding that we're observing, should we start to look at, say, a 1 in 500?
If we talk, say, building floor levels, because that's an easier thing to talk about, then we do sort of say that our design flood is the 1%, but we add a freeboard to that. So we do try and account for uncertainty in those estimations, and in even uncertainty practically by adding a freeboard. And typically that's 500 mils. But my hobby horse, I guess, is that instead of adding a set freeboard for every place in Australia, we should actually be considering a larger event like the 1 in 500 as a replacement for the 1% plus freeboard, because then we're getting a far greater insight into the uncertainty and the sensitivity of the uncertainty in our estimations. So typically in a very large floodplain that's storage dominated, the flood level result won't be as sensitive to changes in flow or changes in rainfall or changes in anything else that causes the uncertainty. But in a steeper catchment that's more conveyance dominated, we will get, it typically is more sensitive to changes in flow. So therefore, if we were to run a larger event like the 1 in 500 as a pseudo replacement for our freeboard, then that's not a bad way of trying to get a better gauge of what the uncertainty in our rainfall and our flows is actually meaning on the ground.
Nice.
It becomes more difficult, I think, when you're talking linear infrastructure. Linear infrastructure is all about conveyance, typically through the piece of infrastructure. So, in that circumstance, then it probably needs a little bit more thought and a little bit more, and it definitely happens when designing large linear infrastructures, and more thought goes into the sensitivity testing around that.
Oh, thanks. Danny, you have some comments on that?
Yeah, so a lot of flood studies and council work that's done can use the 500-year event as a proxy for climate change as well. And it's also useful to model those rarer events to pick up any significant changes in flood hazard or flow paths. So those states and territories and countries that advocate for flood studies to look at the full range of flood events, as New South Wales does, all councils, when they're looking at their planning schemes and infrastructure planning, should be looking at not just a straightforward narrow view of a 1% AEP, but looking at those more extreme events. And as I said, they can be used for sensitivity analysis for things like climate change or freeboard as well.
Thanks. And that's one of the things that I've seen, I guess, in a couple of places. Well, a good chunk of my career was as a contractor for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers doing levee designs. And when there was a government mandate to start building in risk and uncertainty procedures, instead of just doing their standard 1 meter or 3 feet of freeboard all across the board, they decided to make it the freeboard relevant or relative to the 95% confidence level for the 1 in 100 event, which after doing hundreds and hundreds of these studies ended up being pretty close to the 500, the 1 in 500. So if you look at a 1 in 500 AEP flood level and put the top of your levee there, then you're not wasting your money somewhere where that freeboard gets you up to the PMF versus some areas where that freeboard only got you up to an extra 10% confidence. So it should be looked at on that basis. Now, one of the questions that I've heard asked on this, if you look at these stages, typically, if you had, 100 years worth of record, and these are the levels you've got, and then all of a sudden you end up with some event like this up here, where you've got a flood level, meters above anything that's ever been experienced. Typically, to me, that would represent some sort of breach scenario, or maybe some levees are put into place and they're holding water back. Have you, anybody on the panel, or even in the background on the Q&A line, if you can comment on this, were there any breach events, or did levees figure into any of these, which would not really allow you to use them in a typical flood frequency analysis sort of way? Any comments on that? James, I saw you had your hand up. It might be on a different issue, but I'll ask you that question first, and then you can follow back, circle back to the other one.
Okay, yeah, no, I'm probably not the person to answer that question, but I will just quickly touch on, because Kathy mentioned freeboard, which is my favorite. Yeah, she's right. I mean, I think the idea of freeboard has always been a bit strange to me, but it certainly has a place, because like someone said in the chat, you don't just have freeboard for the uncertainty, you have it for wave motion and all sorts of other things as well. So yeah, the 1 in 100 year level, planning level, for all intents and purposes, it was pretty arbitrary. It's sort of designed on picked based on design horizons, but yeah, for a lot of catchments, intense rainfall is more sensitive than other catchments. So, for instance, the Gympie catchment, we did a sensitivity study where we multiplied the IFDs by 13%, and our 1% AEP estimate changed by 1.13 meters. So, yeah, straight away you've eaten up all your freeboard, and that catchment at Gympie is very sensitive to changes in rainfall volume and runoff. Whereas in other places, you might only get 200 mils increase. So it's very, very catchment dependent. So yes, totally agree that something needs to be done in terms of using higher, rarer AEPs for design of setting minimum floor levels.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, no, that's a great comment. Mark, if you have anything to add there.
Yeah, I think we should be looking at the flood range when we're setting floor levels as well. If the PMF's only a metre above the 1%, well, what's the big deal? But if it's like Ipswich or Windsor in New South Wales, where it's 10 metres or more, then half a metre of freeboard on a 1% level is just ridiculous, because it won't take anything much rarer than that to have huge consequences, the sort of consequences we've seen in this month. And just using a single level is not enough. And we're not even factoring in climate change. Okay, we might not know what climate change is going to exactly do, but we're building in failure. We're not even going to achieve our 1% objective if we're not factoring some best guess on climate change. We're setting ourselves up for failure in the future. So, yep, it should be higher.
Yes. All right. Bryson, comments?
Yeah, I'd just like to add in this debate, I had a US colleague some years ago say to me that we should be not designing some structures or putting in place policies that are risk-free, but rather putting in policies that minimise the consequences of failure. And I don't know whether really enough of that type of work is done. And I think there'll be an onus on the profession to start thinking that way, because I mean, if you are of the opinion that climate change is affecting rainfall extremes and they are increasing, then it'll take a while before these trends are picked up in the historical record. So I think it's always a good point to look at. Okay, if the structure I designing fails, what could happen, and can I put something in place to minimise the damage?
Yes. And yes, and I see one comment here that can't we give any direct answers? And boy, yes, that is a valid question. Can't hydrologists ever give direct answers to anything? And I would say, yeah, absolutes are impossible to get out of statistics. You can get probabilities and you can get confidence levels, and you can do risk and uncertainty analyses. But when we're talking about anticipated events, yes, it is certainly there are many uncertainties, and it's going to be very tough to nail a hydrologist down.
Craig, we're not really very good at doing uncertainty and risk analysis. What we do in Australia, and the profession is at fault, all of us, is we just run them and go, yep, if this happens, it goes up. It doesn't factor into the decision-making process anywhere near often enough.
Yes.
That's what we need to be doing. We just go, oh no, we'll just fall back to the default standard and use that.
Yeah.
But if something's sensitive, we shouldn't be doing that. But the number of times I've pushed that, the pushback I get all over the place is incredible. And in fact, I think you get more pushback in those locations that really need to be factored in than the places where it's not such a big deal.
Yeah, and I think what I'll echo here. This came from Tony Ladson, who sent this over to us. He'll be one of our instructors in an upcoming rainfall runoff course. And he provided a couple of things, slides here where in the media we talk about a 1 in 1,000 year event, and when we use words like expecting a 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 500 year flood, these things can be, it's something that we definitely need to consider. And he's got these slides here, and just again to go back to the nomenclature that we've talked about. I like this little die that he's got here. When we're talking about these probabilities, and we're tossing a die a number of once every year, those are the average recurrence intervals, but at some point you end up with absolute certainty that an event is going to occur. And again, this was one of his take-home messages that I'll go ahead and share here. We need to watch out for getting too far into the politics here, but when you read the statement about the record rainfall on the East Coast, destroying dozens of research projects at the University of Queensland, these are ones that also flooded in 2011, and they were rebuilt at the same site because the administrators believed the flood was a once-in-a-century event. Now that's quoted. I don't know if they actually believe that, but that's quoted out of this volume here. So one question then that I wanted to pose to the modelers here, because we want to come out of this with some concrete recommendations. I mean, we're not going to be able to say specifically this is the event that happened, or this is what this is going to be the 1 in 2,000 event is going to be this exactly. But what we can come out of this with 2,000 people here watching this, as an industry, we can do better. So what can we do to make it better? How can we then get into planning and get the ear of the people who are going to be actually making the decisions that are going to be keeping people out of harm's way? One of the things I'll throw up here and on this slide is some of these flood hazard assessments that you can do when we're looking at consequence assessments, not just the water, where's the water, but how is that going to affect people as they're moving around? Given that so many of the fatalities in Australia occur in vehicles or around vehicles, should we in our modeling be taking the evacuation routes better and closing roads sooner, and be using our predictive modeling to get people in vehicles away from these floods, and get this as part of our modeling as well? How often is this done? So if any of the panelists want to comment on, is this where the industry is heading? Can we map individual vehicles and show where they go, where the plugs are in the system, where the constrictions are, and make sure that we get the vehicles out of harm's way?
So
I'd invite any of the panelists to comment.
I could go first, Craig, but I've had a fair go. I could talk about the Hawkesbury and Nepean, but maybe you should go to someone else first.
Yeah. Danny, have you seen any of this, in FMA conferences and things like this? Is this something that is being considered more often?
Well, as Mark alluded to, it's fairly central to the Hawkesbury Nepean strategy that's been in the works, and that'll be a key milestone, I suppose, for New South Wales. We haven't been able to employ a lot of this at the local government level on our own bat, but we do fairly rudimentary evacuation capability assessments as part of our risk management studies. But it's great that the technology's evolving to be able to look at that in more detail.
Yeah, thanks. And whichever space you're in, and we've got people on the panel and attending here from all sorts of industries, whether it's engineering or planning or insurance, modeling. I myself, as a modeler, what do we need to do better? Let's take advantage of the tools that are out there. The hardware and the software has gotten to the point where you can actually track these vehicles and watch where they go when the flood is coming, rather than just stationary buildings. Have a look also at, I'll include some links in the kind of the show notes with the recording, to some of the resiliency that we could build into these structures. And that's something we haven't really addressed yet, but I'll include a link to the one house that Suncorp have put together, where they blast this house with fires and wind and flood, and see what materials can hold up, and how does that figure into the modeling and building some of this resilience. Maybe I'll throw that question over to Kathy. In the modeling with these homes, residential structures and industrial structures, does the building material figure in? And in your modeling, can we show if something just gets completely wiped out versus a more flood resilient structure that can potentially take water underneath it? Instead of blocking that water, it actually allows, something that's either up on stilts, or it allows water into the first floor. Is that something that's being figured into the modeling that you're doing?
In terms of within the modelling, it's not something that needs to go into the modelling, I would say. I mean, we account for structures in conveyance pathways, and, we do that in a variety of ways. But what is important, I think, for structural design is actually, the velocity and depth of the water, which is an output from the modelling. So that output can be used to inform structural design of buildings and other structures. So I guess that, yes, the answer is yes, but not within the modelling itself, typically. Can I move on though to make another point? I think, when we're talking about evacuation and design of structures, etc., we're still thinking strategically, which is great. And that's most of us here are in that space. We're all technical people. We're all strategic thinkers. And, Cray, you're talking about evacuation. We can do that. There's software out there that allows us to, unit-based modelling that allows us to model, where an individual is going to go and what decision they're going to make. But the loss of life that we experience is not necessarily related to evacuation. It's related to people making bad decisions, not necessarily evacuating, but just making, a decision that wasn't the right one, to cross a waterway or to do something that, they've been hopefully educated not to do. If it's flooded, forget it. I think, when we're talking about loss of life, to do with vehicles, it's not typically evacuation. So while I'm not saying that we shouldn't consider evacuation, I think a lot of what has happened in these events has been not so much to do even with strategy, but to people not being educated, either in not crossing a flooded road or not knowing when to evacuate, not knowing that they're in a floodplain, not knowing that this event is going to occur. I think there's a whole range of flood warning and education that, is a massive elephant in the room in this situation. And I think if we don't talk about that, or at least acknowledge it in this session, we're doing a disservice to where money is spent. Because while we can improve the technical side of things, and that's what we all love to do, I think that the big thing with these events is just the lack of education of people, the lack of understanding of people, the lack of warning from government agencies for this event. We saw it in Brisbane. You know, we had a flood coming down the Brisbane River. All the media and the politicians were saying, oh, you know, we're going to have a moderate event, and, you know, everyone was sort of patting themselves on the back. And at the same time as I was hearing that in the media, on the radio, people were being inundated in the local creeks, people who had no idea that they were even in the floodplain. And even those that did have an idea that they were in the floodplain and had experienced events before weren't being warned that dams were overtopping. You know, really simple, basic flood warning messages were not getting out. And I think that it's a big, big message and a big, big learning from these events, way more than our technical modelling can replace.
Yes, no, that's an excellent comment. I mean, a lot of these fatalities could have been prevented, regardless of, you know, if at least these routes had been closed and marked ahead of time, and that takes resources, but it also takes predictive modeling to know when is this coming and when do we need to close this road. When you look at some of these traffic cams and how quickly some of these things came up, it is absolutely scary to think of what would happen. You know, when we look at, I'll pull these ones up right here. When you look at how quickly that can come up, you know, were these roads closed adequately, you know, in time to prevent people from even trying? You know, obviously when they get there and they see it's flooded, they shouldn't try to cross, but some do. Well, maybe those should have been barricaded earlier. And can we, as flood practitioners, do a better job getting that information out there and getting real-time information to the SES people who would need to physically go out and close these roads when they need to? So lots and lots of questions. Panelists, if you could just put your hand up if you want to respond to anything. Talk about unprecedented. I don't think we've ever had over 100 open unanswered questions before. We've had webinars where we get 100 questions, but usually we're able to keep up with these. There have been there's so much response in the background. This is why we got so many people on to try to help answer the questions. So let's get through as many of these as we can. And what I'll probably do for the next 20 minutes or so is just have you address, individual panelists, address the ones that you see. And if you see one that one of the other panelists working in the background has addressed, that you think ought to be raised verbally to the whole group, those watching the YouTube recording later on won't see these questions. And so if there's something that ought to be highlighted for the group, I think we'll just go through and let everybody just maybe tackle one at a time. I'll cycle through the panelists and you pick, go ahead and just pick which one you want to hit, because 107, 108 now unanswered questions. We're not going to get through these today. We'll try to publish the answers for you or the responses after the session. But in the meantime, for today, let's just start cycling through. Mark, you had your hand up. Let's start with you, and then we'll go back through everybody.
Yeah, I was going to comment on Kathy's thing. I think we really need to get better at getting the public to understand our messages and act on them. And I think we need to get better at explaining to the public that if you've seen a few floods, you don't know what a big one's going to look like. Your prior experience is not that useful. But in terms of answering questions, there's a great one from Nicholas Green about, are we negligent letting people rebuild in the floodplain without additional mitigation? Look, that's a politician's dilemma. We all have pretty strong views on that, but it's going to be a pretty brave politician who tells people, I know you're flooded, I know you're not going to get insured, and we're going to make you rebuilding more expensive. And people say you should buy these houses back, but 7% of Australia's housing stock's flood prone. We're not going to buy back 7% of the housing stock in Australia. So I don't know the answer to Nicholas's question, but we need to do more. And what we are doing is probably not good enough. So I haven't answered his question.
All right. Over to you, Danny, if you can respond.
Yeah, I was just going to pick another question, if that's
Yep.
all right, Craig. So there's one from Tom Sigley asking how the recent flood inundation for the northern New South Wales compared with the modelling predictions. I can't speak for the Richmond or Wilson rivers, so not for Lismore, but I can speak for the Tweed River. It matched very well. One of our planners came up to me soon after the flood peak and said, wow, all the areas of blue on your map were 100% correct, or from his perspective. So it was reasonable that every single property that got flooded in the Tweed could have reasonably known of their flood risk, and with appropriate warning and understanding could have reduced their risk exposure through prior actions. What I think caught the North Coast out in this event, and it flowed through from forecasters and the emergency services, was the way that the event evolved. And we saw something similar with Cyclone Debbie in 2017, where although flood watches were out, the predictions were for a 3-day event that was probably going to drop about 150 millimetres in the catchment. And as it evolved, that turned into a 6-day event that dropped 1,300 millimetres of rain in the catchment. So and that was evolving day by day. We're thinking, right, we get through today and tomorrow the sun will be out. But then by the time we got up, there was a prediction of 250 millimetres the next day. And then the next day it said 500 more millimetres. So the forecasting and preparedness for these sorts of weather systems, and this wasn't even an ex-tropical cyclone, which is typically the sorts of things that impacts on the northern New South Wales coast. So I can understand why the people in South Moolumbar and places like that that have uninhabitable houses now weren't able to react according to our known flood risk.
Yeah, thanks. No, that's an excellent comment. Bryson, I've seen you've answering a few of these in the background. Do you want to just pick one to highlight for the group?
There's been a few, Cray, that are talking about, is there a need to update Australian rainfall and runoff? I remember being a part of the technical committee for the current edition, and the view always throughout the whole process was that this was going to be updated, and it would be updated in a more timely fashion than what happened prior to the current edition. I think the big question, though, is where is the funding going to come from to secure this? We were fortunate to get a lot of funding from Geoscience Australia to help with the current edition of AR&R, but where the money's going to come from for an update in 5 to 10 years' time, I'm not certain. But there doesn't seem to be, and this has always been an ongoing problem in this country, there doesn't seem to be a real appreciation for the need for this kind of work, and how much funding is actually required to do it.
Yeah, thanks. And when you think about the 87, that was for many years, the 1987 data, that's what we went by until 2016. That's almost 30 years. And so, would we expect that? So for 30 years, none of the extreme events that were coming around were getting figured in. If we went from, the 2016 update, another 30 years, and waited till 2046 to build in our 2022 events, are we being negligent by waiting that long, or should we be updating? I see one comment here that got upvoted quite a bit. 5 to 10 years, wouldn't that be a more reasonable approach? And yeah, with adequate funding, perhaps so.
Can I answer a couple of parts of that, Cray, though? The document is designed to be a lot more modular, so we can update it in parts. I think updating the whole thing in one go will kill people if they try it again. Mm-hmm. And the other thing is the budget's next week, so we should all watch.
Yeah, no, that's good. Now, I guess I'm talking specifically the BOM IFDs, but yeah, the AR&R we can get that guidance in there a little more frequently, and in some cases in real time with some of the information that's coming in. Now, a couple of things that I wanted to point out. We will get into some resources, but boy, there's so many questions that we could pick from here. Let's go to Kathy. Can you? I see a couple of things that you might line up with your line of work. If you can just pick some of the comments there and maybe just give us your answers.
Yeah, it's hard to pick, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah, sorry. Let's see. Maybe around the terminology use of 1 in 500 and 1 in 1,000, and the misinterpretation of that. So I think, you know, we do have a responsibility as an industry not to use that terminology ourselves. And it's part of the education, isn't it? I can hear even with the panelists, you know, some of us have struggled with that, and we're in the industry and know that we shouldn't be doing that. So yeah, looking again at what you're sharing on your screen is trying to align ourselves with that terminology that's in that AR&R chart there, I think is useful. I think, you know, once we get into the very rare categories, though, you know, it's difficult even for us to talk about, you know, the 1 in 500 as being a 0.2% event. But if we are going to refer to it as 1 in 500, don't call it the 1 in 500 year. Don't use year again ever. But it's the only way we're going to change is if we all actually get on board and do that. And whenever possible, you know, let people know what that actually means. It's not about it coming around, you know, every 500 years. It's actually about, you know, the probability of that event occurring next year is 0.2%, and probably higher if it's a La Nina year.
Yeah, and again, the big questions that are coming out of this this event from a couple of weeks ago is what we thought was the 1 in 500 maybe wasn't the 1 in 500. And once you start figuring these larger events in, I think we've seen a few slides moving up, you know, how that will adjust things. And it doesn't just move it, you know, wholesale. It's a slow weighted adjustment. Now, one disclaimer I do want to make is that, you know, we are early days. This has only been a few weeks since the event. There will be models coming out, and there will be opportunities for peer-reviewed papers and things like that that are going to be more definitive than what we can say on this panel right now. But we did want to address this while the you know, while things are fresh in everybody's minds, while the damages are still you know, something that that we're very aware of, and while it's still in the news, get everybody on to say how are we going to change things going forward so that we can do a better job of preventing the damages and reducing fatalities in future events. I'll turn over to Fiona, give you a chance to pick from the many questions, 111 now unanswered. Thanks for those who have answered the questions already and have put those into that category. But of those questions remaining, are there any that you see that you would like to highlight for the panel?
Well, maybe I'll talk about a couple that I just answered rather than the ones I haven't even had a chance to look through. Okay. So one was about Ray Candivert asked whether there'd been any trends in whether trends had been checked for in deriving the new IFDs, and there was work done on that. And what we, you know, could you see a climate change signal? You couldn't, you know, 5-10 years ago in IFDs at a day or in daily data, that it's just too noisy and the trends are small. But at the shorter durations, and this is consistent with what we would expect from climate change, you could see some increasing trends. But the problem is there's very few gauges at sub-daily durations that are long enough to do that and to really be able to then make a statement for the whole country that we should disregard early parts of the records, because if you do that, then the trade-off is you have higher uncertainty because you've got less data. So, you know, I think, but then there was a second question about, well, what should we do because we expect the atmosphere to hold 7% more moisture for each degree of warming? And AR&R has a very comprehensive chapter that Bryson, you know, led and talked about on a whole, I guess, continuum of types of analyses that could be done to think about climate change impact. And so in that particular case, you know, one of those first screening tests is to test a 5% increase per degree of warming. But as Mark said, I think we've got so far to go in what we do with these sensitivity analyses. It's not enough to just test it and say, oh yeah, it increases. Well, of course it does. What do we do? How do we make different decisions? And I think sensitivity analysis and what we do with uncertainty are areas that we really need to do more work in.
Thanks.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Like I was saying before, when we run the sensitivity analyses, they tend to be pretty crude. Still, we just factor the IFDs and say, well, that's what climate change will be, but it's not really like that. With flooding, and particularly flood damage, increases in rainfall intensity aren't the major cause of flood damage. So if you want to talk about flood damages, then yeah, rainfall is only a very small part of what causes flood damage. And so yeah, you're getting into things like soil moisture, just in terms of the runoff. Does the rainfall translate to a large flood? I mean, we don't even consider things like drier soils because of a warmer climate. All sorts of antecedent catchment conditions that could happen, and then yeah, all the land use and that sort of thing. So land use and land use planning, I think, are far more important than rainfall intensity. That's just my opinion.
No, thanks. Now, a general question, and this will be a free-for-all for the whole panel here. The most upvoted open question at the moment is, where can we pat ourselves on the back? We talk about what went wrong in the response. I know there's a lot of dispute about the, whether the response was appropriate and adequate, and whether the preparation in advance was appropriate and adequate. So there's a lot of discussion about that. We'll include some additional links to some of those discussions and news articles in the show notes. But what went right? Where can we say, hey, we did as an industry, or the communities here adopted these lessons, for example, from 2011, and it was put into practice and it succeeded. And one of the things I'll say is I saw a lot of things on LinkedIn where there were bridges and structures and walkways and things that had been wiped out in previous floods, and when they were rebuilt in such a way where when the same flood levels came, those structures stayed in place. So I'd say that's one thing that was a good thing. Some of the river walks, I think, in Brisbane survived quite well, and some of the bridge structures. So to the panelists, I'll open that up, open-ended. What did the industry do well in terms of lessons learned since 2011? Uh-oh. Is that dead air?
That's a bit of a worry, isn't it, Craig? Look,
yeah.
You mentioned the Riverwalk, but we only learnt from that because it failed last time.
Yes.
We need to move from learning from the mistakes that happen, from identifying potential problems and fixing them. And we're not good at that. We're not good at convincing politicians to invest in these things. 4-year term, it's not going to happen on my watch. Doesn't seem to get through. Yeah. But Danny's got his hand up.
Go ahead, Danny.
It's all right. From I guess a response and preparedness for Tweed, we certainly did learn a lot of lessons from 2017. For example, we always knew we had a flood liable works depot. It got very badly flooded in 2017 and we lost all our plant. This time around, even though we weren't expecting a flood of the extent that we did, our protocols had evolved to mean that we'd moved all that equipment out to high ground. So that worked. Perversely, our 2 years of working in COVID situations and mastering teams and things like that was a really big step forward in being able to collaborate once the power and the phones came back on, and that took longer in some areas than others. But our ability to collaborate externally through teams and other tools that had evolved through COVID was a real advantage. And I've got to say the New South Wales State Government's response to getting people on ground and resources moving, they've had a lot of practice, maybe not as much as Queensland, but a lot of practice in the last few years with the bushfires and East Coast flooding, that they were very much on ground as soon as they could physically get to the North Coast. So a lot of the agencies deserve a pat on the back for getting in and trying to help out those communities as quick as possible, despite the inevitable social media stuff that says that they'd failed their communities. But that wasn't the case in the Tweed, at least.
Yeah, thanks. So, I mean, take home messages. I guess here I've put a chart up here. It's a little bit deceiving because it makes it look like this is so much above anything that's ever happened, but these are just percentiles, and there certainly have been other years that if you plotted them, well, they might not hit where we've got this chart heading right here, but it would be up in this zone. But still, it was a massive event. And the question remains, is this an anomaly? Do we expect the recurrence, or the annual exceedance probability of these events to change going forward, looking at some of these climate systems and looking at the weather patterns going forward? What I'll do here is just put a couple of slides up about some additional resources to have a look at. And again, this is a 90-minute webinar. We wondered whether we should go past the 60-minute mark because some people do this on their lunch hour, and we thought, well, there'll probably be a few unanswered questions at the 60-minute mark, so let's go a little beyond. But I did not expect the overwhelming response that we've had on these comments, and we'll try to figure out how to best address these and get them back to you in a concise way. But one of the things that we can refer you to is some earlier webinars freely available for anybody to watch, and some of our panelists, Rory Nathan, who's in the background, and other colleagues of ours who have participated in these, have got some great information for you. If you're wondering about the probable maximum flood, have a look at this one. These are numbered on the Australian Water School's YouTube channel. Number 120 on the probable maximum flood can get you some information on that. The AR&R one, Australian rainfall and runoff, part 1 and part 2, so that's number 92 and number 109. Have a look at those. Mark and Monique and others go in there, and they give you a free overview of book 1, and then if you're interested in additional coursework in AR&R, you can have a look at the resources in the show notes for those. We do have additional webinars here. Some of our panelists in the background, Jason Evans and Bryson, participated in this one called Climate Change and Extreme Events. What do we expect to happen going forward, and how has Australia in particular figured in? And we've got some international climate scientists on that one as well. Can we adequately represent these things with rain on grid modeling in our hydraulics, and also then flood consequence assessments, which is some of the screenshots I showed you up here previously, that show individual vehicles and tracking those, and how should that figure in? So a number of resources. Again, these are just the last 20 or 30 or so. There's 122 of these available for you in the background. I'll also mention here, we'll go back and have some closing remarks from the panel, but if we could have, if Martin Hendricks, if you're around, kudos to you for staying up until 3 in the morning on your end. I did want to introduce you as we talk about some upcoming coursework where we'll get into meteorology and precipitation. And we're going to talk about all of the aspects of rainfall and runoff. We won't be able to get into a whole lot of detail on these, but give you the basics that we think are most critical for flood modelers and rainfall runoff modelers to know in terms of the principles. So Martin, if you can just introduce yourself and just let us know a little bit about your background. Martin will be our main presenter and teacher for the first couple of these, and then we'll get some other experts involved for the rest of them. So if you could say good day and let us know where you're coming to us from.
Well, I'm from the Netherlands, and it's early mornings here. That's correct. But can I pose a little question about the most interesting discussion that has been going on? I'm not very well aware, of course, of the Australian situation, what's being done. But here in the Netherlands, we had a project, Room for the River, for 15 years going on. So that means allowing space to the river to flood. Are any projects like that going on in Australia? So I'm really thinking about, you can't prevent these extreme events, but you can try to cope with it in the best way. Is that going on in Australia? I don't know. So that's just a general question. And then concerning the course, well, you, Cray, you contacted me in December asking me to contribute to the Hydrology and Hydraulics Essential course. And I've been into teaching for the last 30 years to graduate and undergraduate students. And I have quite some experience in where students can head off in the wrong direction. So I will gladly participate and contribute to that course.
Excellent.
And yes.
Coming at you from below sea level, I imagine, out there in the Netherlands.
Yes,
In
yes.
terms of rainfall runoff and hydraulic engineering, that is the center of it all out there. So we're glad to have you on board. Thanks for saying hi and for staying up late and for answering some of these questions in the background as well on the panel. So let's pose that to the panel. Anybody, Fiona, maybe I'll start with you. Have you heard of some of these efforts to try to open up the waterways that are maybe constrained in these trapezoidal concrete channels and give the river some room? And is that working?
I mean, well, clearly nature-based solutions and water-sensitive urban design will, keep water in the landscape in different ways than traditional ways of channelizing it. But at some point, if you have an extreme event, there's going to be a limit to whatever infrastructure you put in, and we need to make sure that residual risk is dealt with. So I'm not sure that is going to help here.
Yeah, and case by case, but I know they've had massive efforts. The LA River, the very famous one that you see in all the movies. There's been billion-dollar studies to try to figure out how to make it better, and it still just sits there because nobody can figure out how to convey the water any better through a nature-based solution. So when you don't have the constraints, when you can, that would be awesome to do. Maybe I'll have Danny give a quick plug for the Floodplain Management Australia conference. We got about 2 minutes to go here, so I'll have you take a minute on this one, and then I'll have Mark take a minute on the upcoming Engineers Australia Hydrology Water Resources Symposium. Over to you, Danny, first on this one.
Very, very quickly, we welcome all interested parties to come along to our national conference. For those who want to attend face-to-face, it'll be in Toowoomba, Queensland this year in May. There are also options for online registrations for that, but we want to, after so many years apart, we'd love to see as many of our industry friends as possible face to face. We will probably host a similar panel event to talk about this flood event in the conference proper, and with help from Mark Baberstar and our colleague Duncan McCluckey from Department of Planning and Environment, their Environment, Energy and Science Division. They'll be presenting a pre-conference workshop to talk more about AR&R.
Great.
So
and again, if this to some of those attending, if our discussion today seems fluffy, yes, and non-committal, yes, it certainly is. We're raising these questions. We're putting that out there, saying these are things we ought to be concerned about. Now let's get to work. Put in your papers. This one, unfortunately, the papers are already in, but we will have a pre-conference session on AR&R that will benefit from these discussions that we've had. Mark, if you want to just mention something about that pre-conference panel or workshop that you're going to have at this one, and then lead into the Hydrology Water Resources Symposium coming up in November.
Yep. So we at the Floodplain Management Conference in Toowoomba, we'll be running a one-day AR&R conference workshop where we're going to try and get input from people on where we think we should be going and some of the changes and what. But obviously, it will also focus on this recent event. That will obviously have to be factored into because people will have a lot of learnings from this event. And the other thing is the sort of premier Australian conference on the technical aspects of hydrology and water resources, HWRS as we all call it, will be in Brisbane in November 2020. It will be a hybrid event. How much attendance you'll be able to have is a little bit unclear, but we look forward to seeing people at that event. That's now going to be an annual event, the Hydrology and Water Resources Symposium. Abstracts are open. Put in your abstracts, turn up, whether you're physically there or online. It should be a great conference because it always is.
Great, thanks. Yeah, it used to be every 4 years or so, and then it got postponed with COVID, and they just had it last year, and we're going to have another one now. So that'd be great if it was happening every year. That gives people a chance to respond to these events. And again, I think in May is the deadline. So let's take some of this information. All the practitioners out there who have seen what happened now with these events. How did we do? How can we do better? Let's put that into some concrete recommendations that can go forward to be considered, to be peer reviewed. And to be out there and published for the industry at large to benefit from. So with that, I'd like to thank all of our panelists who came on live, especially those who didn't get the acknowledgement in the background answering all the questions. Thanks so much for your efforts there. What you'll see here now is a couple of links on where you'll be able to get the recording link and a certificate of attendance. If you scan that, you should be able to use this for your professional development hours, continuing education credits. Do fill out the survey. How did you find this? Do you want more of these types of events? Normally we do a presentation that takes up most of the time, and we have about 5-10 minutes of Q&A. This was all Q&A. So should we be doing more of this? Let us know. We want your feedback. Do subscribe to the Australian Water School's channels and to the courses that are coming up. You'll see a slide here. There is a lot of need right now for humanitarian assistance in the water space. You saw that in just the response for the floods, political crises going on. How can I help? Well, in a couple weeks' time, we're going to meet some engineers who have spent their whole careers helping out with humanitarian water projects. How can you help, and how can we help as a water industry? Join us for some of these panel discussions and presentations coming up. Courses in how to do your modeling, 2Flow webinars and courses that you can get to through the website. Let's be better. Let's utilize all the advances in software and hardware and be better as an industry to respond to these sorts of events and to allow people to make the best decisions we can to prevent loss of life and to reduce economic damages when these events happen, and they certainly will. These should be expected and planned for, and we as an industry can do better, should do better, and will do better with the benefit of some of these forums and the input and the discussions that we've had. So thanks so much for everybody for attending. We'll see you next time around. Bye-bye.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe by clicking the link below and click on the notification bell to stay up to date with new releases. For the latest in significant, innovative, and critical advances in water science, technology, and management, subscribe now. To build your skills, enhance your technical knowledge, and learn from leading experts in water, visit theaustralianwaterschool.com.au and discover our online training courses, both live and on demand.